Everyone. For those of you watching, welcome to Republic Day special panel on PACT. PACT, as some of you who follow the project might know, stands for Pluralist Agreement and Constitutional Transformation. It is a project funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it investigates the making of the Indian Constitution and situates it in debates about constitution making. Um, I'm very pleased to welcome my fellow co-investigators, Nicholas Gold from Oxford, Sudhir Krishnaswamy from National Law School, Bangalore, Rochna Bajpai from SOAS, Vineet Krishna, CLPR, and Manish Rathuri, also at Oxford. We'll be talking to you today about some of the work that we've been doing as part of the PACT project, some of the research conducted, and some of the work that our team has been doing on platform building. To start off, Rochna, I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more about the motivation behind the PACT project.
Thanks very much, Udit. It's great to be here as part of our team. Our motivations for PACT were multiple. One, as you may recall, was the centrality of the Constitution in India's political imaginary in the present. We've seen it in the last general elections, we've seen it in student protests, we've seen it in the Pathalgadi movement that was in tribal villages, that the Constitution continues to be 75 years after its promulgation, a key part of Indian political life. It isn't a document that's relegated to, if you like, the shelves of libraries or to courtrooms. So the first motivation was to understand this better and to understand what the contemporary meanings of the Constitution are, but also to think about what constitution making may be beyond the founding moment, what constitution making may be as an ongoing exercise of rethinking what constitutional rights, for example, mean in the present, and what state powers, for example, have been addressed by those who've worked with constitutional framework. So that's the first. The second, and for those of us who've worked on the Constituent Assembly debates for several decades, we know that this was a process of negotiation between a very diverse set of individuals, over 300 individuals in the assembly itself who debated and deliberated over its making. From a comparative point of view, this is extremely interesting, the Indian case, because the constitution was not passed as tabled. In fact, there were several amendments to the draft, unlike, for example, in the United States Constitution or the Australian Constitution. In the climate that we inhabit today, we see how hard it is to arrive at agreements, to negotiate agreements between conflicting parties on anything. And here we have an example of a constitution where a large set of people who did conflict over constitutional essentials came, in fact, to an agreement, and an agreement which has lasted over 75 years. The Indian constitution is the oldest in the post-colonial world. So the second motivation was to probe further into how this was done, into the process of negotiation, and how it came to how that resulted in a constitution that a very diverse set of individuals in the assembly, but more broadly, a very diverse and large electorate could put itself behind, could agree to. So that was the second motivation. The third motivation was to look at the aspects of historicization of these debates in greater detail. Participatory constitution making is an area which has received a lot of interest in the last decade. There have been works on Chile, on Iceland, for example, and in the Indian case as well, historians have shown how the process was not just one that was limited to the Constituent Assembly, but that a wide variety of people, including tribal groups from Khasi Hills to a range of petitioners from Hindu Sanatanist organizations, were engaging with the work of the Constituent Assembly, seeking to influence it in their preferred directions. However, a lot of the historical documents, as we know, are subject to decay over time. And one of the motivations of this project was simply preserving these documents and creating an archive of constitution making, which of course reimagines constitution making as being something beyond elite pacts, as something which includes popular participation, but that also makes this documentation digitally available as a free open access platform for journalists, for lawyers, but more broadly for members of the public who have inspired us with their engagements with the Constitution. So let's stop there.
As a follow-up on that, Rotna, you pointed to two important strands of PACT. One, which treats constitution making as an ongoing conversation, something that we carry on doing in the present. And then you've spoken of the importance of the archive, the historical record of the constitution. So a project like PACT that's looking back towards this historical moment, that's looking back at this historical record, um, how does that help us, or how does that help the project also achieve its aims of making the Constitution something that's done in the present? So, how does the historical and the kind of Constitution making in the present strand of the project, how do they interact with each other?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think each of us address it differently in our works. One, as I said, and it's at many levels. One is simply the preservation and making publicly accessible a wide set of documents enables people in the present, citizens, journalists, etc., to get a more accurate historical sense of what actually happened during the making of the Constitution. So one level of engagement that we aspire to is simply to make these historical documents available to a wide range of people for whatever purposes that they would have. And our purpose here is to establish historical accuracy and comprehensiveness. So that's what we've tried to do through research in the National Archives, through Quill's important work in documentation and of these in an advanced digital platform, which has alerted us to order papers and to amendments which weren't sort of known before. And this level of bringing this level of historical rigor, we think can have an impact on historical scholarship as well as practice in the present. So that's one sort of link. The other link, which some of us are exploring in our joint research, is to think about what are the ways in which arguments that were put forward in the public sphere at one historical moment, but perhaps didn't win out then, there weren't enough people behind them then, how might those of us in the present who retrieve these arguments begin to of course, make sense of them in a broader historical context, as I've pointed out, but also deploy these in the present for contemporary projects, which could include activist projects, for example, in relation to how do we reform the structure of the state as we find it, of elections as we find these, for example. So these are a couple of things that I can think of, but I would love to hear from you as well, because this is very much, and PACT is very much a collaborative project in which we learn from our joint endeavors. So I'd love to hear from others as well on the team.
Yeah, in fact, I'll go to Nicholas as well on this. And Nicholas, I do have a question for you and on the platform. And it'd be great if you could also say more, following on from Rochna, on why you think a platform that's collecting a historical record and archive is important for present debates. So, but first, could you tell us a bit more about this advanced digital platform that's being built as part of the PACT project, the platform that Rochna's alerted us to?
Yeah. So there's a question about the processes that write constitutions, which is what is the best way to present the records of those processes? As people watching this will know, traditionally there's a sort of edited volumes of papers put together, and you can read through those records. And if you present them in that way, what you principally emphasize are speeches made, especially for this material. What's interested me for the last decade is to think about the process of coming to an agreement. How do 300 people over 3 years come to an agreement about the text that should be the constitutional text for India? And I'm interested in these processes of debate and refinement and compromise. And so the question is, well, how can you best study them? How can you best put the material together in a way that you can make strong claims and evidence-based claims about how these processes work? So for the last 10 years, I've been working on a digital platform that studies how constitutional convention processes, how constituent assembly-like processes do their work, which involves, in a sense, creating quite an advanced system for tracking the thousands and thousands of proposals made, and trying to give users of the platform as much information as possible about the context within which proposals were made and decisions were taken. What was the information available to participants in this process as they worked on these documents? How were subcommittees used? What was the flow of information between the main constituent assembly and its subcommittees? How can we track, in a sense, where particular clauses originated and why they took their final form? And so the approach that we've taken in the Quill project is to present as comprehensively as we can the history of every amendment and every debate on it, so that people who really want to research in depth why a particular clause ended up taking a particular form after, in the Indian case, 3 years of debate, will be able to chart that. And that means tracking not only successful proposals, but it means tracking unsuccessful proposals as well, and proposals about which people changed their mind. And that's really important if we're going to understand the dynamics of, as I say, refinement and debate and agreement and compromise in a process like this. The other thing we want to do is give people as much access as we possibly can to the primary sources themselves. So we build the sort of digital model of the negotiation so that you can track the language as it goes through. But we also want to enable people to find easily the links to resources that will help them understand the broader context. So that's the motivation behind the platform. Nothing else like it really exists. People watching this may be familiar with various digital technologies for collaboration, maybe familiar with Google Docs or collaboration features in other word processing programs. And some of the algorithms we use are derived from that kind of work in those fields and then put to this sort of historical purpose. But I really felt it was important that this project would use that kind of digital tool so that we were enabling people to do something that's never been done properly before, which is really track the nature of the evidence that we have for these debates with a level of detail and certainty that I think is impossible in non-digital forms, and that drew on work that we'd done in other parts of the world as well, which speaks to Roshna's point about comparative work. And it's very interesting to set these debates in a broader international context and really understand what's distinctive about the truly remarkable Indian experiment.
I'll come to the comparative aspect in a moment, Nicholas, but I first wanted to ask you a little bit about the platform itself. And I'm very pleased we have Vineet Krishna here, who's done a lot of work on the constitutionofindia.net. So this is a question really for both of you. Viewers who are watching this session, some of them may be familiar with constitutionofindia.net. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about what PACT is doing or what the advanced digital platform is doing that goes beyond the work that already exists out there for for the general public and for activists and citizens interested in the Constitution.
Constitutionofindia.net is of course a terrific resource, and when we were first talking about doing this project, one of the things we had to do was really understand what else was out there, and of course constitutionofindia.net is an incredible platform. Amazing work has gone into editing the principal records of the Constituent Assembly and putting them online and providing context and biographies and all kinds of other resources. And in that sense, it's very similar to projects that exist in other countries as well. A very, very important edited collection of materials tagged in particular ways to allow particular types of searching. What those platforms don't allow you to do is really track the history of an individual phrase, to track the process. So it's one thing to present the records that we have in the best possible form, which I think is the focus of sites like constitutionofindia.net. It's another thing to really have a platform where you can say, well, I want to know why this wording exists and not others from a process point of view, not searching for it necessarily in speeches, but actually being able to search for a phrase within the various draft texts that existed from time to time. And if you think of what a session of the Constituent Assembly was like, they might have been considering on any one morning many hundreds of amendments and agreeing some of them and not agreeing others. And so you have to think of the text of the various documents that are considered by the Assembly as being very much constantly in motion, and the job of the secretariat for the Assembly was to keep track of this constant movement of these documents, so that what was and was not properly part of a given text at any one time was constantly shifting. That's I think what we add, and of course doing that work has driven, as you know, some more archival work around the world as we've tried to track down better documentation for why particular proposals were made, or a proposal that might just be mentioned by a title and a number in some of the records that were already extant. We've really done everything we can to try and track down, well, what was the specific form of proposal that was rejected on a given morning or not. That's what I think we add, and we're meant to be complementary to the other resources that are out there. So of course, people are always going to want to be able to focus on the kind of speeches, the kind of biographies, and the other resources that constitutionofindia.net can provide. we provide a different view of the records that, in a sense, focuses on the process of debate and the processes that facilitate agreement, even in a very diverse set of speakers representing a very diverse community. That's what we add.
Thanks. Again, Vineet, going to you, you've now been part of building these two major portals, constitutionofindia.net, and you've also worked very closely in the building of the PACT Advanced Digital Database, the advanced platform. I wonder from your perspective as well, what is it that the PACT platform has allowed that you thought is an upgrade or is something that fills a gap from your perspective? Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. I think I might repeat myself a little bit, or rather repeat what Nicholas said a little bit. But when we started the database back in 2016, our focus was initially just making the Constituent Assembly debates accessible in a sort of in a way which allowed meaningful and easy access. But we always knew that the archive was much more than just the Constituent Assembly debates. If we had to create a constitutional culture of which getting citizens and students and different audiences to engage with primary materials related to India's constitutional founding was important, it could not just be Constituent Assembly debates. We knew there were other materials relevant as well. We then started to add what we call the historical constitutions as well, which were constituent antecedent documents to the record. And then we also sort of did a bit of committee reports as well. So we always knew the archive was huge. And so what PACT allows us to do is to build on that archive is significantly. So committee reports, whether it be sort of submissions by different citizens, not citizens then in a sense, but different groups to the constitution making body. So we just loved the fact that we could add to those materials, but we also weren't completely keyed into the actual physical archive. So in the PACT project, we actually, one of the greatest things that we have done is to actually have dedicated researchers who go to the archives and who, one, collect new archives, but also to verify whether the archives that folks like us have been using are accurate, and they vet it as well. So there's both the addition to the existing archive, but also, and I think maybe Nicholas missed this out, is what the PACT project does with the Quill is to also engage with the constitution making process at a very granular level. So both it's engaging with new materials, engagement at a level of granularity which our website currently doesn't do, but also through other things like visualization, etc. So the PACT project is a great sort of forum for us who've been working with these materials to learn from other organizations, Nicholas at Pembroke, of how they do archival work and how they present it, but also to build on what constitutionofindia.net does, and also to share our experiences with the Oxford team when they build this new database.
Quill, the word quill has come up a couple of times, and I think that's an opportunity for us to go back to Nicholas to say a little bit more about his work on the Quill project, which started, I believe, with a focus on the American Constitution. So, Nicholas, your work on constitution making or building platforms on constitution making is not new. You've done this for the American Constitution in the past. I wonder if you might say a bit about the differences working between these, as well as what sort of comparative insights we might get from thinking about and studying these constitutional texts together, the American and the Indian one.
The quillproject.net website takes its name from the fact that the authors of the American Constitution are always depicted sitting at these desks holding quills, and I was always interested in, well, what did it really mean for people to be in a room and work together in that way? And we built the original platform to study the records of the 1787 Federal Convention that wrote the American Constitution. The American Constitution, compared to the Indian one, is a tiny document. It's I always like to say to my colleagues, it's shorter than the average undergraduate essay. And it took the Americans 3 months to write. So the original version of the Quill platform and the original visualizations that we built were really intended to study that process. And then moving on from that, the process of writing the many hundreds of different constitutions that have from time to time governed the individual states of America, because in America, all of the individual states are sovereign. I always intended that the platform should be general in its application, and that we would have an eye to global constitution writing, especially more and more in an age when there is more and more skepticism about democracy and about the legitimacy of founding democratic documents. And so that seemed very important to me, that that other countries too have had this experience of writing constitutions, and we needed to work on those. But the Indian material is just at a different scale, I think, as befits a country that is on a very different scale. So whereas the average American state convention can meet for 2 or 3 months, maybe a year at very most, to write the state level documents, and the federal convention can meet for 3 months to write a federal document, the level of detail and the complexity of the issues in the Indian case are just completely different, which is, I think, why that process took 3 years, as people worked through very complicated, very technical problems in an international environment that was, of course, very interesting as well, and quite dynamic at the time. And so we discovered very quickly in the process of looking at the Indian records that our existing technical approaches simply were not sufficient. That the level of detail that we had to work with as we tried to keep track of tens of thousands of amendments as opposed to merely thousands, and to build those into these dynamically written documents to capture the state of the text at any particular moment, that the technology we were using was simply not sufficient. And so we've had to completely revisit our internal representation of all of that information to capture the process of the Indian debate. It's also true that different groups of people behave differently, and sometimes the assumptions that we had made that enabled the computer to do its work for the American case simply didn't apply to the Indian example, as things would be debated in very different orders. And so if you weren't careful, the reconstruction of the document texts that we were building would not be correct without changing those assumptions. And then at a more surface level, because all of that is hidden from the user, except that they want the information they've asked for in a timely manner, and so we need to be able to process very quickly. At a more surface level, the visualizations for the American case, dealing with much simpler material, are not sufficient either. So that if the most basic problem with visualization is simply to fit the information that somebody needs on the screen that they're using, and you can easily see that if there are 1,000 individual amendments in perhaps one sort of very short convention in the American case, versus tens of thousands in the Indian case, that we're going to have to adapt different strategies for visualization and for searching and for other things. And then the last thing is that the needs of users are different, and we've engaged with different user groups to say, well, actually the needs of educators in India, the needs of lawyers, the needs of researchers is going to be different again. Vineet mentioned, one very simple thing. We very much wanted to capture digitally the form of the archive for India, so that we represent digitally as closely as we can the nature of the records that are to be found in different archives, so that researchers have good access to that. And that's been less important in the American case, for example, but it's important for this. So it's been a project that's been very challenging at times. There've been moments when, you know, we've really wondered whether we would find solutions to some of these problems. But we have. But those are the kinds of challenges, some of them very hidden and behind the scenes, and some of them very much in the foreground from the point of view of users that we've had to grapple with.
Thank you very much. At this point, we'll stop for a short break. We've been speaking about the Advanced Digital Platform. Once we're back, we'll be talking a little bit about the exciting research happening in the PACT project after a short break. Welcome back, everyone. We've been speaking so far about the work that the PACT project has done on building an advanced digital platform to study the making of the Indian Constitution, but another important strand of the project has been research into the Indian Constitution. Now, as many of you watching would know, the last few years have been a fertile period for research on the Indian Constitution, with many books, many scholarly articles on the Constitution, on Indian constitutional thought, constitutional theory, the making of the Constitution. And I'd like to hear from the PACT team what research they've been conducting and how that speaks to some of this recent scholarship of the last few years. So starting with you, Sudhir, could you say a little bit more about some of the research that you've been doing as part of the PACT project?
Thanks, Udit, and let me start with a short kind of review of where Nicholas left us, which is that if we have an expanded archive of materials, new materials put together in new ways with an emphasis on process, what is it that we can say that is interesting about Indian constitutional development that may not have been said before? And I think that's the motivating starting point for many of our interventions in this project. And so for me, there have been two directions that I've taken that in. The first is quantitative, which is that if, as Nicholas hinted, that if we have the materials in a digital format, it's not just that you have paper materials in a digital format. Not only does it enable suddenly disability access at scale that we simply haven't had for the Indian Constitutional Archive, it also allows us to make a range of investigations that simply couldn't be done before. And I don't mean just like a philological kind of investigation into just the roots of ideas or phrases or words, but something a little more structural than that, which is, can we identify new ways of responding to contemporary deep political concerns, concerns about constitutional origins, for example, or issues of are we borrowing from somewhere, and if so, from where, and so on. And I think that the Quill platform, constitutionofindia.net, allows for this kind of investigation at scale. So this is one kind of methodological track, which is to try and explore what we can say at scale and quantitatively. And I think we can address some interesting questions there. And, for example, the historical origins of Article 14 are surprisingly more closely tied to the Constitution of Japan than to all the connections that we ordinarily draw from American constitutional theory or British ideas of the rule of law. And so it's quite interesting to expand the horizon of what we can do if we pay attention to text carefully. So that's one track. And the other track was to try and look at these debates and processes in a political normative way, but not in the stock way that it's been done in the Indian debates, which is to really treat the constitutional debates as some subset of a sort of history of ideas, history of political ideas. I'm going to take once again Nicholas's cue and to say, can we pay a lot more attention to process? And here I find that, Elster's modeling of constitution making, which has a sort of methodology that emphasizes kind of more kind of micro foundations type motivations questions of what people might be doing in deliberative contexts, might give us a very different set of ideas about how to think about Indian constitution making. Now, there are these large gaps in how we understand the constitutional archive, right? We have extensive debates, and then we have gaps of a few days, and then suddenly the position changes. Now, obviously, something has happened, maybe in the assembly and outside the assembly and elsewhere, and we need to bring a better texture and a better understanding of these processes by which constitutional positions got developed. And so I'll just take Article 37, of the gateway article to the directive principles of the Constitution. And for far too long, there has been the lame suggestion that it drew extensively or primarily on the Irish constitutional experience. And this is clearly not the case. And we learn by looking at the archive carefully and the processes by which that article came to be formulated, that we can nuance these kinds of arguments and bring a better account of both deliberation in these assemblies than we have done so far. So these are the two kind of methodological tacks that and once again, the digital nature of the archive and the expanded range of the archive allow us to do this. So that's what I've focused on in the past few months, besides looking at the entire corpus with fresh eyes. But yeah, back to you with it.
Thanks, Sudhir. Manas is one of our team members who's spent a lot of time in the archives, has contributed a lot to the building of the platform, but is also conducting research based on what he's found in these archives. Manas, could you tell us more about the kind of work you're doing at the moment, how what you've been finding in the archives has informed what you're currently working on?
Yeah. So I think we're trying to be part of a larger conversation here, which is something that Rochna mentioned is in the recent years, there's been this proliferation of literature on the participatory nature of constitution making. And we've moved beyond just, there's always been a lot of focus on like the plenary debates and speeches of some of the main more, towering leaders of the anti-colonial movement. And what we're trying to do, and what I'm also trying to do through research on the PACT project, is to explore how there was a wider set of deliberations happening outside the Constituent Assembly. And through exploring the archives, and I'd also like to respond to something that you said earlier, that in a way, the archives has allowed us to explore how the Constitution is, when we say it's an ongoing project, we also are responding to the certain hollow deification of the Indian Constitution, which venerates it almost as a cultural artifact and a national heritage almost, where you cease to see the Indian Constitution as an active document. And this whole idea of the Constitution as a living document is something that we keep on hearing. But what we forget is that the Constitution is an active site of political struggle. And it's not a static document which needs to undergo this hollow sort of deification where you strip it off, where you sanitize the history of Indian Constitution making, from its very complicated and bloodied context. The partition and the different kinds of social struggles and political negotiations that took place between a very diverse set of groups. And what my research is trying to do is to, after having looked at this large corpus of archival material, a large part of that archival material is representations from different individuals and social groups, economic groups, which were responding to, for whom actually the Constituent Assembly becomes a site of expressing collective anxiety about what is going to happen to, their group interests and privileges. And these are not just groups which have been historically marginalized. These were also groups which were expressing reservations about the fact that their privileges would be stripped off. So my research currently, I'm focused on looking at petitions, these letters, petitions, and memorandums from groups professing to preserve Sanatan Dharma traditions in India. And you see this fear and anxiety among many such groups that the sort of impending doom that they feel with, the incoming constitutional transformations, and there is this anxiety that the state would interfere in our religious traditions, practices, and customs. So an example of that is that we see in these archival documents hundreds and hundreds of petitions protesting against the Article 19 of the draft constitution, which eventually became Article 25, on regulation of religious practices and throwing open religious institutions to certain sections of Hindus. And there is this intense fear amongst those groups. And the ways in which they respond to these constitutional transformations is something that I'm trying to locate in a larger conceptual story of the emergence of the Hindutva movement in India and the different strands of that movement and how they were responding to these constitutional transformations. And this has allowed us, like I was saying, to place the Indian Constitution, to look at the Indian Constitution as a very dynamic, as a processual, as an active sort of project. And how we can link it to the current sort of conversations is that, like I was saying, that in the political domain, in the way in which the Constitution story is being articulated, is through veneration, through looking at that book as this holy book, which emerged apparently out of this harmonious sort of agreement, and it's a product of almost it's articulated in a way in which it's a product of this unbroken sort of chain of democratic traditions in India. So this idea of India being the mother of democracy, for instance, which we've been hearing a lot, and political leaders highlighting how there were ancient democratic traditions always existing in India, as this India being the land of sort of fountainhead of democracy, and the Constitution making stories placed in that unbroken chain of democracy in India. And I think one thing that PACT would contribute to would to look at how, and also to contribute to this conversation of how the Constitution of India was not just a fight against a foreign sort of colonial domination, it was also an internal struggle. It was an internal struggle against this entrenched feudal social order. And there were, it was not just an inside-outside fight, but it was also like a conflict, a churning from within, which gave us this document. So I think that's the larger sort of point of my research, and yeah.
Excellent. It's also interesting when we think about groups that were trying to influence the Indian Constitution, we do occasionally find surprises, right? So you mentioned how there are these internal struggles. In my own research, I've been noticing how it's the associations of merchants and traders who are
Yeah.
looking for representation in Parliament, who want functional representation,
Yeah.
so that traders and merchants can be represented in Parliament.
Yes.
So there are all kinds of surprises that the archive does throw up.
Yeah. That is one of the most fascinating things that I saw, is that the merchants associations and traders were asking to be identified as a constituency, even for like elections after the constitution is written. And I think that's a fascinating sort of snapshot of constitution making that we have to explore. Yeah.
I suppose it's also interesting because there's often these debates about functional representation that trace their histories back to guild socialism and alternative
Yeah.
representation. And then you start looking at the archive and you see that there is a demand from a very specific group that wants representation and finds functional representation as the avenue through
Yeah.
which they advance that demand for their group's interests.
Yeah.
But I suspect that all of us who've been working on the PACT project have found surprising moments like these in the archive. And I'd like to go back to Nicholas as well as Manas on guiding us through some of these surprises that we've found as we've been going about the PACT project. Over to you, Nicholas.
I think two really interesting surprises for me. Both of them come from my work really on American constitution writing. One is that it's always puzzled Americans that their federal constitution doesn't seem to be much copied around the world. One of the things that this project has helped us see as we've tracked individual phrases is that people in non-American settings are paying a lot of attention, but it's not to the American federal constitution so much, it's to the state constitutions, many of which have been written much more recently. And so it's just fascinating to see, as the database grows, phrases sort of being considered in the Constituent Assembly that were sort of live issues at state level. Not federal level, but state level in America, and that's absolutely fascinating. The other thing that is wonderful to see really sort of sketched out properly in the PACT project is an argument about the due process clause, which sounds terribly technical, but which is terribly important for Americans because it's the basis of most of the judicial review by the US Supreme Court. And so there's a wonderful sort of debate in the middle of the Constituent Assembly debates, where there are essentially three positions taken. One is that, of course, India needs the due process clause. That because this is a basic guarantee that you need in the law. The second position is, but look at what the Americans have been doing with this due process clause. It's given in America, but not in Britain. Courts enormous powers, or courts have used it to take enormous powers for themselves, and that's a terrible idea. And then a tiny minority view that says, yes, look at what American courts have done with this clause. That would be great for India as well, because we want more judicial control. And it's wonderful to see that sort of debate playing out. You get a real sense of the ways in which people are not only building for India, but looking across to what's happening in other countries as well.
I want to come back to you as well on this, Manas, on surprises, things that you found in the archive that you found were you hadn't expected to find as you went looking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know about the number of amendments that were tabled in the Constituent Assembly, thousands and thousands of amendments. And our research, and not just my own research, but other people who've been working on Quill, has been the very fascinating aspect of it is to find the amendments that were not part of the public record, which were and that has also sort of allowed us to shift focus from the more sort of mainstream actors of the Constituent Assembly, and to highlight the sort of work of a number of other members who were very actively sort of engaging in the Constituent Assembly, and the different sort of amendments we've been able to find in Delhi, in the National Archives of India, at the Bodleian at Oxford. That's something that has, like I said, has allowed us to sort of look at a wider array of actors who were part of the constitution making project. And I think the second thing also is that, like, I mean, in my research, I'm focusing on groups, but there were also a number of individuals who might not necessarily form a part of the elite sections of societies. So these might just be a government school teacher or a railway station officer, or an advocate, or just a shopkeeper, writing to the Constituent Assembly with a certain sort of sense of assertion that presenting to the Constituent Assembly full drafts of and full amendments to the draft constitution, that these are our suggestions to amend certain articles. People had prepared like these little handbooks that they were submitting to the Constituent Assembly, and so that's like a very rich story, which has, I think, been the most fascinating, and also has instilled among us a certain level of appreciation of how people were engaging with this process, which is, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation, even in academic sort of literature on the making of the Indian Constitution. So that's been very fascinating.
And the amendment story that you mentioned as well is fascinating, because for those of us who've read the Constituent Assembly debates for years, sometimes it's a bit frustrating. You hear of amendments number 579, 580, or what have
Yeah.
you, and we're told these are not moved, and you would often wonder, well, what were these amendments? And we now, of course, have a record of all these amendments that are not moved formally, that are not recorded in the Constituent Assembly debates. And we now know the text of these
Yeah.
amendments, which were hiding in plain sight 5 minutes away from Pembroke College, Oxford, in the Bodleian Library. And it'll be fascinating to share these
Yeah.
with viewers of the PACT platform. But I do want to go back to a problem, a tension that Manas raised earlier, which is a project such as this that is so focused on the Indian Constitution, on the constitution making process. Um, is there a risk that it might end up deifying, as Manas said, the constitutional text? Is there a risk that it might end up venerating the Indian Constitution? And that's a question for you, Rochna, but also Sudhir, if you'd like to come in on this. How do you navigate this risk of deification?
Yeah, no, I think that's a real risk. And some of the ways, because on the one hand, we do want to foster greater appreciation of this process as, for instance, more participative, more democratic than it's often assumed to be by contemporary scholarship, which is focused in the last decade. It hasn't looked at how historical examples of constitution making can also have elements of participation and democratic engagement. But even as we're doing this, we are seeing, on the other hand, as has been pointed out, that this was a contested process. It was a tension-ridden process, that some of the participation, for example, was from conservatives who thought that the rights to equality that the Indian Constitution guarantees went too far, that the abolition of untouchability, for example, shouldn't be a fundamental right. So we see, reams and reams. So on the one hand, we are, as it were, excavating these petitions, but in our attempt to reimagine the archive, we do want to put on the table and give public access to the full range of petitions, some of which were sought to counter the expansion of rights that the Constitution brought to be. So to make a a process more or to be more attentive to how it was participative doesn't necessarily mean that that the process is more inclusive or pluralist. So that's the first tension, the tension between participation and pluralism, if you like, and inclusion, that our project in a sense foregrounds. That yes, if we can make it more participative by bringing in a lot of excluded voices, but if these voices had more influence over the constitution making process, would the outcome have been more pluralist? Possibly not. That's one sort of question that's raised by our project. The second, and I mean, this goes back to my older work on minority rights and affirmative action provisions in the Constitution. On the one hand, we do need to celebrate the Indian Constitution as being, in a sense, ahead of its time in recognizing both rights to equality in great detail, in much greater detail than any existing constitution. So not all the grounds of sort of societal discrimination, several grounds are laid out in the constitutional text, which make it the longest written constitution in the world, as we know. And also we have a recognition of constitutionalization of affirmative action and of rights of minorities to educational autonomy, for example, which went much further than existing liberal democratic constitutions of the time. So these are achievements, pluralist achievements of the constitution making process in India. But on the other hand, as I and have documented, and others have as well, because concerns of state consolidation, of national unity, of social transformation were important. The Constitution also creates a very powerful state and puts limitations on a range of civil and political liberties, puts limitations also on the minority rights that I mentioned. So there's a normative deficit that I've written about in my book, Debating Difference, that remained with regard to the recognition of minority rights. And that we see in the resurgence of criticisms of the Constitution today. So in other words, I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically the process was contested. Making it more participative would not necessarily have resulted in more pluralist outcomes. And we see that even though there was recognition of minority rights and affirmative action as part of a liberal democratic framework that was ahead of its time, certainly in the 1950s, America had not even had its sort of civil rights moment there. Nevertheless, there were, if you like, normative deficits that remained with regard to the recognition of rights, which made for limitations that we see have become increasingly prominent today. So I'll stop there, but there may be others who want to add to that.
That's fantastic. I'm also interested in Sudhir's perspective because I can appreciate how this dual hat of the lawyer who must use the Constitution, draw on the Constitution, and a constitutional law scholar who then adopts a critical attitude. You do have this dual role to perform when engaging with the Constitution, and I wonder how you navigate that tension of studying it closely, understanding it, but also being critical of it as you've gone about the PACT project.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of thinking through the problem of deification. I mean, Manas mentioned it a couple of times. I see that that there might be an element of the political rhetoric of deification, but I'm not overly concerned that deification is the predominant impulse in a popular sense. So I don't see the problem to be as big as it might seem if you just followed a few voices on the debate. But I think that as a matter of the project and the way we think about these materials, two things are important. First is that we don't present, as much of the scholarship in this field does, just a curated subset of the archive, overlaid with such a heavy narrative, which almost hides the ball. And I think Indian work on the Constitution has had too much of this. So there's too much of the overlaid work and too little of the work that stays closer to the text. And my sense here is that by making the archive transparent to anybody who wants to look at it, the original primary materials, I think there's a great service, intellectual service here, which militates against deification. So I think that's the first point that I would like to make. The second is that is to take a strand out of what Rochna was mentioning, which is to really present materials like these as a history of the present. It's the debates in the political present that animate concerns with the archive. So, so long as we are alert to presenting the archival materials with all the nuance and tension and contestation that are there, we resist the idea of divination, that somehow the Constitution was divined by more sagely people than we are or we can ever be, or some such thing. So I think that kind of resistance to that model of constitutional production is possible when you emphasize deliberation. And my sense is that that's exactly what we're doing. So for me, the deification problem is not a major problem. I think the big deficit of the moment is really a fair popular understanding of how these rather spectacular documents have been produced. And if we push against that wheel, I think there's a lot to be gained from that. Yeah, back to you.
Thanks, Sudhir. The question of popular understanding, part of the work PACT has been doing, we've been building this platform, of course, conducting research on the Indian Constitution, but one part of the project that's been very well led by Vineet Krishna is trying to facilitate this sort of popular understanding, taking the Constitution into educational settings. Could you tell us a bit more about this work that you've been doing, Vineet?
Sure, that. So even before the PACT project, at least at CLPR, our view was that while making the historical record accessible was important, it was just the first step. And the second step was to actually go into different public spaces and take these materials and facilitate engagement with them, with the diverse audiences. So we've been doing workshops for many years. But what the PACT project allows us to do is to first take new materials to these audiences, to expand the types of audiences that we engage with, and three, also try different modes of engagement with these audiences. So over the past year and a half of the project length, we've engaged with law students, but more importantly, other categories of folks. We've engaged with medical students, design students, and also law clerks at the Supreme Court of India. And at least our experience has been that if curated and presented carefully in a relevant way, even materials which I guess all of us are very passionate about these materials, but maybe not everyone, but all of these materials do trigger excitement and engagement that we would not have expected. So when we went to medical students, when we presented materials which are broadly sort of a little bit customized for them, with sort of regards to privacy, etc., that they might face in their profession, they resonated with it very well. With journalism students, the way we ran those workshops was more of, well, you see all these debates happening in the public sphere, some of which Rochna and Sudhir just mentioned about the Constitution. Here is a project and its digital resources that help you make sense and almost fact check some of the claims that the Indian Constitution is sort of embedded within in the public sphere using primary materials. With the Supreme Court, I think was in some sense, I wouldn't say more important, but a little more critical, because some of these law clerks are engaged with assisting judges in with research and are also often writing judgments, depending upon which judge. What we've seen over the Sudhir is the constitutional law prof, not me, but at least what I've seen with the Supreme Court is that the use of historical materials has been rather ad hoc. Sometimes cherry picking, sometimes could easily be used to just further a particular point, both in terms of the written submissions that lawyers make, but also in the judgments themselves. So with the law clerks, what we did was to provide some sort of system in which some materials are useful and some might not be, to provide almost a sort of method of using historical materials when deciding constitutional law cases. So we find that overall, that one, the workshops work. Two, that if you pay attention to the materials and how you curate and present them, it can vibrate with different sets of audiences. And three, that it might trigger an interest, which might actually sustain much beyond the workshop itself. So as I was mentioning to Rochana, the workshop we did for design students at the Shrishti Manipal School sort of inspired them to then do their course projects as the Indian Constitution. So that's what we think might happen with most of the workshops. And this year we're trying to do a similar set of workshops for just educators, so that it's not contingent on me or the PACT project, but educators themselves can sort of take some of the methods and ways of engaging that we've used in our workshops across their sort of professional careers and different cohorts of students at undergraduate, school, and postgraduate levels.
I've been wondering, Vineet, you've been going around talking about the Constitution to new audiences at a time when the Constitution is, of course, being talked about a lot politically. It has been in the news a lot. The history of the Constitution making process has been in the news a lot. How has that affected the way you conduct your workshops? Have you had to navigate some of that in your work during the workshops?
Not so much, Udit. I think this relates to the point that Sudhir was talking about. Presenting materials in their purest form, with questions and prompts that push them to engage with the materials in a specific way, itself is not too much of a sort of political project per se. All right, it does not reek of any sorts of charged political claims, though this might very well be in the students' minds and the workshop participants' minds. But the way we at least think that the way to go is for present the materials to them, convince them briefly of why we think it's interesting, and then give them a worksheet and different exercises in which to reinforce that, but to engage with it directly. Not so much with sort of secondary literature or journalism, though I'm quite sure that students have that in mind. But there is definitely a sense of, even with folks who think that, yes, the Constitution is a sort of beacon, etc., but when they read a slice of the debate, which is a little, say, uncomfortable or quote unquote illiberal, all right, they then sort of almost immediately discover that constitution making was a complicated process. People had different views, etc. And once you've triggered that interest, then hopefully at least a significant portion of the classroom then goes on and explores it themselves. And that's what we've seen happen with the workshops. And the PACT project allows us to reach a more diverse set of groups that we otherwise did not have the chance to reach out to.
Yeah, I imagine at least some of your audiences do have a view of these founding figures in mind who, through their wisdom, just arrived at this constitutional text because they knew what to do. And for them, it must be fascinating to see the degree of internal disagreement and participation and debate that went into the making of the project. And I think it's been a great privilege to share some of those insights that we've been developing as a team with the rest of the with others interested. in the Indian Constitution. Well, that's it from us for today. You've heard a lot about the kind of work PACT is doing. We are in the process of building this advanced digital platform. There's scholarship being produced by members of the team. Do watch this page for the work that we're generating for the digital platform. You can follow us at pactproject.net or follow us on Twitter at pact_project. And that's it for now. Do watch this space, and we look forward to sharing the work with you.